Your bank account exists because a government decided it should. That sentence sounds obvious. It stops feeling obvious the moment you sit with what it actually means, not as a philosophical observation, but as a practical description of something you use every morning to buy coffee, pay rent, move through your week. There is a clause in most deposit agreements that most people have never read. It is usually buried somewhere around page 11 or 12, in a section titled something like Account Access and Availability. It says, in language that is technically clear and practically invisible, that under certain conditions, the institution reserves the right to limit or delay withdrawals. Not deny them, limit them, delay them. The clause does not specify what those conditions are. It does not have to. The conditions are determined by the same system that decided the account should exist in the first place. In the years between 1789 and 1794, France ran an experiment in what happens when that system decides to renegotiate the terms. Not slowly, not through policy adjustment, through collapse. The people who emerged from that period in roughly the same financial position they entered, it did not do so through luck, and they did not do so through panic. They did so because of something they had been keeping quietly for generations, something that did not require a government to decide it had value, something that did not require an institution to honor a promise before it could be used, something that the chaos of the revolution could not devalue because it had never been defined by the system that was collapsing. This is the story of what that asset was, how it actually functioned across one of history's most financially violent decades, and most usefully, why the mechanism behind it is not a relic of the pre-modern world. It is sitting inside a pattern you can identify in your own financial life right now, today, if you know what you are looking for. What follows is 4 moments where that pattern appears clearly enough to read, not as illustration, as evidence. The first one is not where you expect it to start. Paris, 1790, summer. The assignat has been in circulation for less than a year. On paper, it is not money not yet. It is a bond, backed by the value of church lands that the revolutionary government has seized and is in the process of selling. It is a transitional instrument, a bridge between the old fiscal order and whatever comes next. The government assures the public that the supply will be carefully managed, that the backing is solid, that this is a temporary measure. Within 18 months, the assignat is circulating as currency. Within 3 years, there are 12 billion of them in circulation. The backing the land has not grown. Only the paper has grown. A shopkeeper in Lyon in 1792 does not need to understand monetary theory to feel what is happening. He can feel it in the gap between the price he paid for flour last month and the price he is paying for flour this week. He can feel it in the faces of customers who used to pay without thinking and now count their assignats twice before handing them over. He can feel it in the specific, nauseating mathematics of a wage that has not changed and a bread price that will not stop moving. The surface problem, if you were a French citizen in 1792, appeared to be the assignat. If only there were better money, more stable money, money the government had not debased, you could get through this. That was the visible problem. Most of the financial commentary of the period focused on exactly that. But the deeper problem was something that the assignat only revealed. It was a problem about the nature of the promises that money is made of, and who had the power to change those promises, and how quickly they could change them when they needed to. The assignat did not cause the vulnerability, it exposed it. Every family in France had been living on a foundation of institutional promises without knowing the foundation was there. The revolution didn't move the furniture. It removed the floor. The families who felt this least were the ones who had been quietly keeping something that did not run on promises. Here is the part that does not appear in most accounts of this period. The aristocracy of pre-revolutionary France was not, as a class, financially sophisticated in the modern sense. They did not have diversified portfolios. They did not have access to inflation-linked instruments. Many of them, perhaps most of them, held substantial assets in forms that the revolution swept away entirely. Titles, rents, privileges, legal rights that produced income without requiring the holder to do anything except be who they were. All of that disappeared. Not gradually. Overnight, in some cases. The 4th of August, 1789, the night the National Assembly abolished feudalism, was the night an entire structure of wealth became worthless before the sun came up. And yet, a specific subset of that same class, not the wealthiest, not the most politically connected, but a particular type of holder came through the revolutionary decade in a condition that allowed them to rebuild relatively quickly afterward. Some of them funded their own emigration. Some of them paid informers. Some of them, when the worst had passed, returned to France and reconstituted something recognizable from the life they had left. The asset class they were carrying was not land. Land could be seized. It was not titles had been abolished. It was not paper of any kind, French or foreign. It was not even primarily gold coin, though gold coin appeared in many of these stories. It was portable, physical, concentrated, and crucially unlegislatable. The revolutionary government could abolish a noble's right to collect rents. It could not legislate away the value of the emerald sewn into the lining of a coat, gemstones, fine jewelry, small format works of art that could be carried in a bag, objects whose value was not a number printed on them, but a quality embedded in them, quality that had been recognized across cultures and trade networks for centuries, and would continue to be recognized regardless of what any French government decided to call itself next Tuesday. This sounds almost too simple. It sounds like something people already know. Store value in hard assets. Yes, understood. But the mechanism at work here is not just hard assets good. It is something more specific and more useful than that. The function these objects served was not storage. It was translation. Think about what translation means in this context. When the assignat collapsed, and by 1796 it was worth less than 1% of its nominal value, the problem was not merely that people had lost money. The problem was that the language of value had broken down. The numbers that used to mean something had stopped meaning anything. Wages, prices, savings, debts, all of them were denominated in a unit that the market had lost faith in. The whole system of numerical value was running on a substrate that no longer existed. In that environment, to do anything, to buy bread, to rent a room, to bribe a gatekeeper, to cross a border, you had to translate. You had to find something that both parties to the transaction were willing to treat as real, something whose value did not derive from what a government had printed on it, something that could speak across the breakdown. Gold coin could do this. But gold coin was heavy, traceable, and illegal to hold in some periods of the revolution. A single louis d'or was also too large a denomination for most daily transactions, the equivalent of handing over a large bill when you need to buy something worth a few coins. Small, portable, high value per gram objects solved the translation problem at the right scale. A moderate gemstone or a fine piece of jewelry could be exchanged, bartered, used as collateral, carried across a border without declaration, sewn into a garment without detection, and critically converted into the local currency of whatever country you arrived in, because the merchants and jewelers of Amsterdam, London, and Vienna did not need a French law to tell them what it was worth. The asset did not need the French financial system to function. That was its entire advantage. Now notice, the families who held these assets did not hold them because they had predicted the revolution. Many of them had been accumulating jewelry, fine metalwork, and small-format portable art for generations, not as financial strategy, but as status expression, as gift exchange, as the normal vocabulary of aristocratic social life. The financial function was a secondary property that became primary when the primary system failed. They had not built a crisis portfolio. They had, over generations, quietly accumulated a class of object that did not require institutional permission to be valuable, and when the institutions collapsed, That secondary property became the only property that mattered. This is the pattern worth knowing. Not the asset class, the property. What makes the object useful in a breakdown is not its material composition. It is the fact that its value is embedded in it rather than promised to it. Every asset you currently hold either carries its value within itself or depends on an institution to honor a claim. Most modern financial assets belong to the second category. Your bank balance is a claim. Your pension is a claim. Even most equity is, at some level, a claim on a legal structure that requires courts and governments to function. None of those things are bad. Claims are how modern wealth works. But the ratio of embedded value to promised value in your financial life is worth knowing. The French aristocrats who rebuilt after the Revolution had not planned to need the embedded value side of the ratio. They had it anyway, because it was the cultural default of their class. Most people today have almost none of it. If this point feels abstract, consider what happened to a different group at a different moment when the same translation problem appeared. Germany, 1923. The hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic is one of the most studied financial events in modern history, which means it is also one of the most misunderstood because the version most people know focuses on the dramatic numbers. Wheelbarrows of banknotes. Prices doubling every few days. The spectacle of extreme nominal inflation. The detail most accounts skip past is the one that explains who survived it well and who did not. It was not primarily about what people held. It was about when they could move. The families in 1923 Germany who maintained purchasing power across the inflation were, in many cases, not the ones with the most sophisticated assets. They were the ones who could transact without delay. Because the hyperinflation did not destroy value uniformly or instantaneously, it destroyed value in the gap between earning and spending, between selling and buying, between deciding to act and being able to act. A worker who received his wages on Friday and spent them Saturday morning lost a manageable amount to inflation. A worker whose wages arrived on Friday but whose bank was closed until Monday, or whose transfer was delayed, or whose account had restrictions, that worker lost his week. Not to bad investment, to friction. The same dynamic, in a more severe form, applied to savings. The families who held assets that required institutional intermediation to convert property sales, requiring notaries, financial instruments requiring banks to process, accounts requiring authorization to access, were trapped not because their underlying assets were worthless, but because the machinery of converting them had slowed to a halt under the weight of the crisis. Meanwhile, prices moved every hour. The people who came through the 1923 inflation best were not necessarily the people with the hardest assets. They were the people with the most liquid hard assets, physical objects they could transact directly, without waiting for a bank to open or a lawyer to sign. Keep your eye on something in the next section. Track how often the key variable is not what people held, but how quickly they could use it, because the same variable appears in a context where most people do not expect it. Argentina, 2001. The Corralito. In December of that year, the Argentine government restricted bank withdrawals to 250 pesos per week, per person. This was framed as a temporary measure. For most depositors, it lasted more than a year. For many, the accounts they eventually recovered were worth a fraction of what they had deposited, not because the bank had failed in the traditional sense, but because the government had subsequently devalued the peso against the dollar, and their dollar-denominated savings had been forcibly converted to pesos at an exchange rate the government chose. A teacher in Buenos Aires in December 2001 had done nothing wrong. She had saved carefully, kept her money in a reputable institution, followed every reasonable piece of financial advice she had ever been given. Her savings were accessible on paper. In practice, she could not touch more than 250 pesos a week from an account that was supposed to hold several $1,000s. The teachers and workers and small business owners who came through the Corralito in the best condition were not the ones who had predicted it. Almost no one predicted it. They were the ones who, for various reasons, cultural habit, family tradition, distrust of banks built up over decades of Argentine financial instability, had kept a portion of their savings in physical form, outside the banking system. Dollar bills in a safe, gold coins in a drawer, jewelry purchased over years of ordinary life. Not as a crisis strategy. As a cultural default, the same cultural default that French aristocrats had maintained for generations, that Weimar-era German families had leaned on when the banks slowed down appearing again in 2001 Buenos Aires, among working-class families who were not thinking about financial theory when they put $200 in an envelope and kept it under their mattress. The asset class varied. The property did not. In each case, the object that functioned was the one whose value did not require an institution to confirm it. Here is where an important honesty lives. Not all of these crises were the same. The Corralito was painful, but Argentina recovered. Most families rebuilt within a decade. The French Revolutionary collapse was more severe, more prolonged, and more structurally comprehensive. It did not just freeze assets. It dissolved the entire social framework within which most wealth had been defined. The Weimar inflation was somewhere between the two. Catastrophic for those caught in the wrong position, survivable for those with the right properties, and ultimately short enough that people who held their nerve and held the right assets came out recognizably intact. The lesson is not that all crises end in catastrophe, because they do not. The lesson is that what determines the difference between difficult and decade-long setback is almost never the severity of the crisis itself. It is the ratio of embedded value to promised value in the household that lives through it. There is a detail in every one of these cases that most accounts skip past. It looks like a footnote. It is not a footnote. In every case, revolutionary France, Weimar Germany, Argentina, in 2001, the people who came through best had not made a last-minute decision. They had not read the warning signs and rotated their portfolios 2 weeks before the event. They had accumulated the relevant assets gradually, over years, as part of the ordinary texture of their financial lives. The French aristocrats' jewelry had been in the family for decades. The German merchants' gold coins had been accumulated over a working lifetime. The Argentine's envelope of dollars had been built up in small amounts every time there was a little extra, a practice passed down from parents who had lived through earlier Argentine financial crises. This is the pattern that changes how you read the opening. The accumulation was not strategic. It was habitual, and the habit was, in every case, rooted in a cultural memory of what money can become under stress, a memory that the families concerned had not theorized but had absorbed, generation to generation, as a kind of practical folk knowledge about the nature of institutional promises. Most people in developed economies today do not have that cultural memory. The 20th century, particularly the post-war decades in the United States, Western Europe, and Australia, was long enough, stable enough, and prosperous enough to erode it. 3 or 4 generations of stable banking made the cultural habit of embedded value accumulation feel unnecessary, then quaint, then invisible. It is not invisible in the historical record. It appears every time a financial system undergoes rapid structural change. And it appears not just in the aristocracy, not just in the wealthy, but in ordinary working households, teachers in Buenos Aires, tradespeople in Weimar Berlin, small merchants in revolutionary Lyon, who had maintained some version of the habit for reasons they might not have been able to articulate. The families who rebuilt fastest after each of these crises did not rebuild because they had made better predictions. They rebuilt because they had preserved one thing the crisis could not reach, the ability to transact without asking anyone's permission. If you found this pattern worth following, and the next piece builds on exactly where this one ends, showing what happened to the people who held these assets in the wrong jurisdiction, like and subscribe. The structure of that mistake is where this particular thread gets genuinely uncomfortable, which brings you back to that clause in your deposit agreement, the one on page 11 or 12, the one about account access and availability. You do not need to believe a crisis is coming to ask a simple question about your own financial life. you do not need to be alarmed. You need only to do the same inventory that the Argentine teacher could not do quickly enough in December of 2001, the same inventory that the families who navigated the revolution had already completed, quietly, years before they needed it. Of the assets you currently hold, how many require an institution to confirm their value before you can use them, and how many would function regardless of what any institution decided tomorrow morning? That number is not a reason to panic. It is a reason to know it. If you have been watching a similar pattern in your own country's financial history, comment the year below.